Dr. Cory Slechta, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
I am Deborah Cory Slechta, Professor of Environmental Medicine, Pediatrics, and Public Health Sciences, and Acting Chair of the Department of Environmental Medicine at the University of Rochester School of Medicine. I served as Chair of the Committee on Gulf War and Health Volume 10, which was released February 11th of this year. The committee that I was chaired was asked to review and evaluate the scientific and medical literature regarding associations between illness and exposure to toxic agents, environmental or wartime hazards, or preventive medicines or vaccines associated with Gulf War service, paying particular attention to neurological disorders, including Parkinson's, MS, ALS, and migraines, to cancer, particularly brain cancer and lung cancer, and chronic multi-symptom illness, also known as Gulf War illness. Volume 10 updates two earlier Gulf War and health reports, Volume 4 in 2006 and Volume 8 that was published in 2010. The committee made recommendations for future research on Gulf War veterans, and I would note that this committee was composed of experts in neurology, epidemiology, pain, psychiatry, neurocognitive disorders, environmental health, and toxicology, and they were clinicians and researchers, none of whom received funding from Gulf War illness research programs. Volume 10 basically followed the approach used by earlier committees. We held 2 public sessions at which we heard from representatives of the VA, from Gulf War veterans and veteran service organizations, Gulf War researchers, and representatives of the VA Research Advisory Committee. We did not address policy issues such as service connection, compensation, or the cause of or treatment for Gulf War illness. We conducted an extensive literature search, reviewed the volumes 4 and 8 conclusions, as well as their primary and secondary studies. We also looked at animal toxicology, neuroimaging, and genetics. We tried to be totally inclusive. We divided our studies into primary studies. They had to be published in peer-reviewed journals or demonstrating reporting rigorous methods, including information on a persistent, not acute health outcomes, used appropriate laboratory testing if applicable, and had a study population that was generalizable to and representative of the Gulf War population. Secondary studies were those studies that didn't meet all of these criteria. Many of the secondary studies relied on self-reports of diagnoses rather than examination by a health professional or a medical record review. We used the same categories of association that were used in the previous volumes. I won't go through all those. Suffice it to say we have a sufficient evidence of a causal relationship, sufficient evidence of an association, limited suggestive evidence of an association, inadequate, insufficient evidence, or limited suggestive evidence of no association. The committee found that in spite of many millions of dollars that have been spent on researching the health of Gulf War veterans, there has been little substantial progress in our understanding of their health, particularly of Gulf War illness. The Volume 10 committee found little evidence to actually warrant changes to the Volume 8 conclusions. We fundamentally agree with the Volume 8 conclusions regarding the strength of the associations between deployment to the Gulf War and adverse health outcomes. Veterans who were deployed to the Gulf War have an increased risk for many long-term health conditions, including PTSD, Gulf War illness, chronic fatigue syndrome, functional GI conditions, generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and substance abuse. And in the testimony that I've provided you, you can see our categories of association with different health effects summarized in box 1. As requested in its statement of tasks, the committee had additional discussions pertaining to Gulf War illness, specifically neurologic conditions and lung and brain cancer, as well as Gulf War illness itself. So Gulf War illness, of course, is the signature adverse health outcome of having served in the Persian Gulf. Multiple studies have found that some Gulf War veterans, regardless of their country of origin and their different deployment-related exposures, have persistent, debilitating, and varying symptoms of Gulf War illness. In spite of over 2 decades of research to define, diagnose, and treat Gulf War illness, little progress has actually been made in elucidating the pathophysiological mechanisms that underlie it, the exposures that may have caused it, or the treatments that are generally effective for it. Gulf War illness is not an easily diagnosed condition. The committee concluded it is not a psychosomatic illness, but it does, like almost every disease and disorder that we know of, present with diverse symptoms, many of which overlap with other health conditions such as chronic fatigue, neurodegenerative disorders, musculoskeletal. The committee concluded that though the existence of an animal model would be advantageous for identifying and evaluating treatment strategies, we caution that developing an animal model is really precluded by the absence of any objective measures of chemical and non-chemical exposures during Gulf War service, let alone the frequency, duration, or dose of those exposures, or the highly likely interactive effects of multiple exposures, about which we know almost nothing. We found it unlikely that a single definitive causal agent will be identified in the many years after the war. Furthermore, many of the Gulf War studies have excluded the psychological aspects of the condition with regard to both diagnosis and treatment, although veterans report symptoms such as chronic pain and sleep disturbances that may be amenable to psychological therapies alone or in conjunction with other treatments. We found little new information pertaining to MS, Parkinson's, or Alzheimer's disease or migraines. We did recommend that ALS is the only neurologic disease for which we did find limited suggestive evidence for an association, but because the time frame has been too short to really look at this, we recommended additional follow-up for prevalence of ALS in this population. Similarly, we found evidence for brain cancer to be inadequate, insufficient, and we found no statistically significant increase in the current risk of brain cancer in deployed Gulf War veterans compared to non-deployed counterparts, a finding that's actually mirrored in another recent IOM study. With regard to lung cancer, in the 10 to 15 years follow-up that have been reported may not, again, like ALS, have been an adequate time frame to really see whether, in fact,
Dr.
there is
Slechta, I'm going to have to ask you to move along, simply because you're at 7 minutes right now.
Sorry. Okay. In conclusion, what is striking about this and prior Gulf War and Health Committee's finding is that I'll just skip to the end. Let me just quickly go through these. Recognize the connections and complex relations between brain and physical functioning and do not exclude any aspect of Gulf War illness with respect to improving its diagnosis and treatment. The Department of Veterans Affairs and Department of Defense should develop a joint and cohesive strategy on incorporating emerging diagnostic technologies, personalized approaches to medical care into sufficiently powered future research to inform the studies. I would also say, in regards to what I heard before, the importance of biomonitoring of exposures before, during, and after military. The involvement in the military is going to be critical to ultimately providing any associations to chemical exposures. There need to be follow-up for neurodegenerative diseases that have long latencies and are associated with aging, as I mentioned before. And let's see. Without definitive and verifiable individual veteran exposure information, further studies to determine cause and effect relationship between Gulf War chemical exposures and health conditions in Gulf War veterans should not be undertaken. We did come up with a list of outcomes where we believe that there is sufficient data already to suggest an association, that we don't need to do more studies to re-demonstrate those. Some where 25 years after the war, we're not likely to see anything, and so some of those kinds of health conditions didn't warrant follow-up, as well as some that we said had a longer latency and still needed to be considered. And finally, one other thing was to begin to break out sex-specific and race, ethnicity-specific health information, which may be important not only to understanding different vulnerabilities by sex and race, but also in terms of understanding mechanisms and treatment for disease. Thank you, and I'm sorry for going over time.
Thank you, Dr. Slechta.